Hello, my fellow comic book collectors. This is going to be a bit different than my typical video. It's not unboxing. I'm not going to be talking about some new comic that I have or anything like that. I'm going to be talking about the market itself. The comic market right now, as we all know, is super hot. It is incredibly hot. I remember like last year I bought like an X-Men #1. I was like so keen. I was like, oh, I got this X-Men #1. I kind of got bidded up a bit and ended up paying like $16 or $1,800 for it. And at the time I thought, oh my goodness, I way overpaid for this. And it was like a 0.5. It's like a really low grade, really beaten up copy of X-Men #1. And I thought I overpaid. And I'll never, I'd never be able to sell it for what I bought it for. Fast forward a year later, and that comic is now worth $3,800. That's how crazy the market is. That even these low-grade, beaten-up copies are becoming very expensive. And it's not just one or two comics that are that way. It's right across the board. It's like if you spec on comics like last year and then you just sort of pick 10 random comics, well, a year later, you're probably going to be right on every single one of those comics. And that is not normal. That is not a healthy market. That's not a typical market for anything. If you play the stocks, if you just buy regular products, that's not normal that they all go up within a year. And not just go up a little bit. We're seeing prices double, triple, quadruple within that time frame. So what is happening? And I want to kind of address that hot market thing. And I want to show you what I see as a perfect storm for potentially why the market will either go through a correction or maybe even crash. And I don't want to be the kind of bearer of bad news and doom and gloom, but I kind of want to make people aware that we're heading into sort of a dangerous time. And with that in mind, I want to show you why the market is what it is today and where it could potentially crash. So what we have right now is kind of like a very unusual circumstance. We have the whole COVID situation where people don't have access to comics. Really, they don't. They have a very few select places where they can get comics. They have, some of the local comic book shops are open or limitedly open. Like my local comic book shop, the way it opens is the store itself is not open, but what they'll do is they'll bring out like into sort of like an open area, outdoor area with like a covering so that it doesn't get destroyed. All the comics. They'll bring like the ones that just came out, the brand new comics. And they might not even bring all the ones out. They might just bring a few of the titles. So what ends up happening is you don't get access to all the comics. And you don't get that experience of going into the comic shop, looking at the long boxes, hunting through and finding all those great comics that you want to buy. So as a result, what we have is we go to eBay or we go to a few handful of sites that sell comics, and we think that these comics are really scarce because, there might be hundreds of people that are interested in the comics and very few vendors that are actually selling the comics. And when they do sell, they probably like slowly sell. Like what they'll do is, 2 or 3 vendors will release the comic at once, and then, those sell, and then a few more will release it afterwards. They don't all release all the comics at once. So what ends up happening is it looks like that comic is very, very scarce. So that's the first thing we have, this kind of false scarcity of the market, where it looks like these comics that we're buying, they're very limited. They're just not enough to go around. And whenever you have that kind of scarcity, well, it's supply and demand, and you will get the situation where people will, you'll have a seller's market where the market will reflect that scarcity. So that's the first thing that I see. Now, the next thing that I see is we have another COVID effect, which is people are not going out. They're not spending their excess money. They have like a lot of extra money that they're just sitting on because they're not going out, they're not going to restaurants, they're not going to the movie theater, they're not doing the normal stuff that they would normally do. So what we have is people with extra money. And another thing we have is a situation where people are a little bit wary of the stock market, and they hear that the comic market is hot and that the prices are going up. As I said, you could spec on 10 random comics and probably make money on it. And that's not normal, but that's what seems to be happening. So you get a lot of newbies coming into the market with all this extra money, and that also brings more fuel to the flames. So you get all these extra, people coming into the market. So you have scarcity, you have lots of buyers, you have lots of buyers with money. And you have a stimulus component where people have this extra money that, it's almost like play money because it's extra money that they didn't really earn, but they just sort of got from the government. So they don't really value it the same way. So they will just spend it on whatever. GameStop. So it's like these are kind of like somewhat what's fueling the market right now. Another thing that we have that we didn't have when I originally started collecting comics 30, 40 years ago is the guide. Now, when I was first collecting comics, we had the Overstreet guide, and that would come out once a year. And the prices that you'd go and pay for like an older comic would be based on the guide. It would be like a yearly price. So you would just look it up. They would look it up in the guide, and they say, well, maybe you're a good customer. Maybe we'll give you, 10% off guide or 50% off guide if it's really, them being nice. And that was kind of the way it was done, where there wasn't that constant updating of the guide. It was a once a year thing. And sometimes you would even get like your local comic book shop having an old guide where it was like maybe a 2-year-old guide where the prices hadn't really gone up much in those 2 years. So, you'd have that kind of thing as well. So what has happened now, and things changed in the 90s, actually. We had the Wizard magazine in the 90s, and that would have like pricing that was kind of like more of a monthly thing because it would come out once a month, and you would see the prices changing, and you'd say, oh, wow, this comic must be really hot because last month it sold for 10% less, and you'd see that kind of effect of the guide on the pricing, where people would sort of base what is a fair market value on whatever the guide said. And everyone would price based on that. So you would get the situation where every month that comic would be, kind of spiking or tanking. And, sometimes that happens as well. So what happens with that kind of market is you have much more rapid updating. Well, now we actually have an even more interesting situation where the guides are way more advanced, and they update not just monthly, but they update maybe hourly or as sales happen. So it's instant updates. So a price will spike, somebody will buy something and you'll see, oh, wow, that comic is now hot. It's all of a sudden somebody's willing to pay $1,000 for it. Wow, that must be something that has, is really on fire, and we must, kind of see what's going on there. And that guide impact will generally be felt throughout the market. To reinforce that, you'll get a whole bunch of YouTube channels like mine. I don't necessarily spec too much, but you'll get the situation where you'll have like a lot of YouTube channels like Comic Tom or there's a whole bunch of them. But Comic Tom is probably one of the best examples. Long Box, Love Affair. There's a lot of really good channels that do spec videos where they basically talk about hot top 10. And what happens is they do it based on what has just sold. So they'll say, oh, that X-Men #1 just had a record-breaking sale of X dollars. Well, all of a sudden that becomes the fair market value, even though maybe it's not necessarily a fair assumption of what that fair market value is. A good example of this is when I go to Heritage and I buy on Heritage, what I'll do is I'll actually set what I want to pay for the comic. And I'll base it on the guide, and I'll base it on what I've seen the sales history be. So I kind of guess that it's really worth about this much, based on the past sales. And so I'll put that price in, and I'll actually bid a little bit below it because I want to get a good deal. However, there are the cases where you'll get one or two buyers, or usually two or three buyers, I should say, that are bidding on something and they all want it. And as I said, it's a scarce market, so it seems like that X-Men giant size or that Fantastic Four #1 or whatever it is. Well, that there's only one issue of it, and this is the only chance that you're going to have to get it. And what ends up happening is people they'll have that fair market value in their mind, but then they'll generally overbid because you'll have two or three people just competing to get that comic. And because they all think that it's rare, well, then they're going to overpay. One of them is going to overpay. And then that price gets broadcasted across all the YouTube channels saying, oh, look, this comic is spiking in price, when it's really only 2 to 3 people who might not be necessarily savvy about what they're buying, or they might be, buying based on FOMO, or they might be buying based on just sheer, I want that comic. And what happens is that spike gets felt in the market, and it then gets reflected in the pricing. What I've seen over and over again is a situation where eBay will actually have, the fair market value. You know what the fair market value is, and if it's like $1,000 or $100, well, the price on eBay will be 20% above that. It's almost like they've already built in that correction on the price into their pricing, because as with this hot market where things are just changing rapidly, well, when you're putting something on eBay, you're usually listing it for like a week, like 6 days, a week. And what ends up happening is if the price kind of goes up in that time frame, well, you don't want to be in a situation where you undersold your comic. So what they'll do is they'll generally put in 20% above the fair market value on eBay. And generally what ends up happening is somebody will see those higher prices, and because of scarcity, they'll end up overpaying because they don't know that you can get it for fair market value or even less than fair market value. So we have this kind of perfect storm. We have a whole bunch of people with extra money, a whole bunch of new people that don't know necessarily the market that well. And we have a situation where there's this false scarcity. So all of these things are creating the perfect storm. And then we have this guide impact where the guide is constantly changing and giving that kind of false sense that the prices are going up. And that, well, they are going up, but it gives that sort of false sense that it will always go up. So that's kind of the situation we're in right now. Now, why do I say that the market is going to collapse? Well, there's things that are going to change. All of those things that I just talked about are about to change. What we have right now is we have this is almost like the COVID effect, this whole thing. What we have coming up in July is they're talking about reopening everywhere with no limitations the US market. And what that'll mean is the local comic book shops will be open, people won't be wearing masks, they'll be much more willing to go out. And we're talking about this happening in July. And another thing that will happen is their government won't be giving any more stimulus checks. So people won't have that play money anymore. And so you have now more comics coming into the market, and you have less people with less money. Because not only are they going to be going out more, because people will be like so excited to go back to the movie theaters, go back to the shopping malls, go back to traveling, they're going to have less excess money to play with. So what's going to happen is you have more, product on the market, and and more options to buy that product, and you're going to have people with less money to buy. So that's the perfect storm against the market, where the market will, sort of have to balance that out. And another thing that we're seeing is a very weak economy. All this lockdowning for a year, well, that does hit the economy really hard. And what ends up happening is not only do we have these kind of situations where people want to get out and do things, but we also have the situation where a lot of people have lost their jobs. There is that kind of rough time going on right now that will be in effect when the market reopens, when things get back to normal in July. So one of the things that I'm saying in this video is expect a major correction to happen in July. I don't necessarily believe that all comics are going to drop in value. It's not going to be like the apocalypse or anything like that. It's not going to be the 90s again. But you will see a correction. And you can quote me on this and comment below. If you think that I'm totally out to lunch, tell me. I want to hear your opinion. Do you think the market is overly hot? Tell me. The other thing that I've seen is there's a lot of people that are talking about this overly hot market. And I think we're getting to the point where there's almost that buyer exhaustion as well. That, the sellers are always going to be keen that, oh, my price has doubled, tripled, whatever. But the buyers aren't going to be so keen to pay those bigger and bigger prices. And what you can have happen is a bubble can pop. And what you have to do, if you're trying to buy comics now, what you have to do is take, Reggie Collects actually did a really good segment on this. And I want to give him a shout out for this. He talked about the concept of a blue ocean. And what ends up happening is everybody sort of goes to the comics that are on those hot lists, and people focus on those. And those comics are going to be really subject to this effect that I'm talking about, this perfect storm, because they're going to be scarce. There are going to be a lot of people looking for them, and it doesn't even take that many people to look at them. Like generally, most of these comics we're talking about, there's maybe about 5 or 10 copies on eBay, and you get like hundreds of people from YouTube channels. That's that's enough of a scarcity that that it can drive the price up. So what happens is anything that is on those hot lists, well, they're going to be really subject to when the market actually opens up. So what you have to do is look at the blue ocean, look at the deep, wider spectrum of comics. You'll notice a lot of my unboxing videos, I'm not buying the hot ones that are on those lists. I'm buying comics that I love. I buy comics that I think are cool. So I'm buying a lot of seduction and innocent comics. I'm buying certain comics that I think are just really cool. That I think will be always kind of cool. And those are comics that will go up in the future. They might also be overpriced now because, as I said, there is this false scarcity. But at least they're more like blue chips. So blue chip comics are where you want to be. And that I actually put a caveat on that I wouldn't necessarily recommend X-Men right now. I wouldn't recommend some of these hot blue chips, but the ones that I'm talking about are more like the golden age, silver age, that that they're always going to be scarce. There's only a certain number of comics out there, and that these are ones that will hold their value over time. So generally what happens, just to give you a little ease of the fear of a total market collapse, what generally happens with a boom bust market is you have this trend that goes up like that. And it's kind of like you'll have the way the trend works is as it goes up and then there's a correction, well, that correction is still higher than the initial beginning of the spike. So the general trend is up over time. And that generally means that if you bought early on and you're holding these comics for a year, then you're probably okay. But if you bought something maybe within the last few months, maybe you'll find that those comics have dipped in price. However, if you're buying comics that you love and you buy comics that you think are long-term spec, you'll probably be okay. So with all that said, don't worry, the sky's not going to fall. But this is my thoughts behind why it's a potential collapse. Thanks for watching. Bye.